it is now my pleasure to introduce to you Jamie Cole, who is one of the hardest working, most dedicated champions of justice in the service of law. That is to say, law in the service of justice. She's always understood the relationship between those two from her work at the NAACP, from her work in law school, and now from her work at North Carolina Conservation Network. She's extremely well organized, extremely efficient, and extremely passionate about her work. And it's been my distinct pleasure to get to know her through a variety of different means, some of which surprised me initially. I started my career as an attorney, as a criminal defense attorney, many years ago, back in the days when everything was on paper, and not only on paper, but on oddly sized paper. I can remember the criminal justice system as a little file box with these tiny, oversized envelopes in them that we referred to as shucks. And after the Moral Monday protests led to record numbers of arrests of individuals who were exercising their First Amendment rights in the North Carolina legislature, a number of people who had defense attorney backgrounds were called into service. It had been a long time since I had appeared in district court, and Jamie helped me through that. And I would say that the other work that she's doing now is incredibly valuable, and I have little fear for the seventh generation coming after us in terms of the amount of work that she's going to do with others in this room and with others in the larger justice network to make a change in this world for the better. So I'm very delighted to introduce her as a moderator for our panel, and then we'll have our panelists for this morning come up. So, Jamie, thank you. Let's welcome her.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to see everybody here. I am so excited that Duke is hosting this symposium. I look forward to today. I look forward to future symposiums. I'm already hearing buzzing about ideas for next year, so just so happy to be here and so honored to be here. I'm also honored to be introducing the esteemed panelists that will be talking on an extremely important topic and timely topic of access to water, sanitation, and underserved communities. Now, as Ryke mentioned, I have a history not necessarily in environmental justice. I have been with the North Carolina Conservation Network for 3 years now, and I have been a student of the most awesome school of environmental justice organizers and advocates that I could have ever asked for. And the three people who will be up here today, who I'll be asking questions of today, and who you'll be asking questions of, are remarkable, and I'm honored. I don't have much to contribute. I want to stand back, ask questions, and learn. And I hope that you all are able to receive the information and really take it forward with you as you move in your advocacy and further education. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists today. I'm going to read their bios, and then I'd welcome them to come on up and join me up here. So the first panelist I will introduce is Catherine Flowers. The 2017 FHI Practitioner in Residence is the executive director and founder of the Alabama Center for Rural Enterprise, a nonprofit organization which focuses on leading participatory community development projects to improve infrastructure and quality of life in poor rural communities in Alabama. Flowers also worked with the Equal Justice Initiative, an organization which provides legal assistance to promote civil and environmental justice for marginalized communities, with a specific focus on challenging policies that trap racial minorities in cycles of poverty and injustice. Ms. Flowers is an internationally recognized advocate for human rights to water and sanitation and works to make the UN Sustainable Development Agenda accountable to frontline communities. She recently visited Standing Rock to demonstrate solidarity with protesters. Ms. Flowers is the Director of Eco-Ministry and Environmental Justice for the Center of Earth Ethics at Union Theological Seminary and participated in the launching of the New Poor People's Campaign with Reverend William Barber and Repairers of the Breach. Please welcome Ms. Catherine Flowers. Next up is Colin Bailey. I had the honor of chatting him last night, and I'm really excited to introduce him. He is the Executive Director and Managing Attorney of the Environmental Justice Coalition for Water. An accomplished social justice attorney, Colin supports EJCW's policy of the human rights to water policy agenda, programs, and grassroots member organizations. Building upon California's historic adoption of the human rights to water policy in 2012, EJCW supports the grassroots effort to implement and enforce this mandate statewide. Colin serves on several advisory committees for various state agencies and academic institutions. Colin received his JD from UCLA School of Law with a certificate from the Public Interest Law and Policy Program and the Critical Race Studies Program. As a legal aid attorney, Colin served as lead counsel for a community coalition that, in 2012, after a 5-year campaign, defeated a proposal to construct an underground natural gas storage facility. The facility threatened massive explosion and fire and contamination of groundwater in a low-income community of color in South Sacramento. Colin was appointed to the California Air Resources Board, AB 32, Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, and the Department of Water Resources, California Water Plan Update 2018 Policy Advisory Committee. Please join me in welcoming Colin. And last but certainly not least, Omega Wilson was the founding board chairman in 1994 when the West End Revitalization Association incorporated as a 501c3 nonprofit. WERA's mission is to support access to basic public health amenities, safe drinking water, sewer lines, housing, streets, sidewalks, and stormwater management for people of color in marginalized communities. WERA filed complaints under the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Environmental Justice Executive Order to challenge the planned 8-lane interstate corridor that would destroy 2 historic African and Native American communities in Mebane, North Carolina. A moratorium was placed on highway construction. More than 100 homeowners have since had sewer lines installed and dirt streets paved for the first time, even though the homes have been within 2 to 3 blocks of Mebane's municipal sewer treatment plant since it was constructed in 1921. In partnership with the Haw River Assembly Riverkeeper, WERA filed a federal and state Title VI interagency fracking complaint, the first in the Southeast, related to failure to access public safety by over a dozen North Carolina and federal agencies. Please join me in welcoming Omega Wilson. So I have a series of questions that were provided to me, and I will be asking them of our panelists up here. But before we do that, I'd ask for each panelist to take about 3 minutes and give your own introduction and remarks, and then we'll move into the questions.
Good morning. I'm not going to say a whole lot because I got a lot more to say later, but and I'm going to, defer to my fellow panelists. But my name is Catherine Coleman Flowers. I'm a native of Lowndes County, Alabama, and coming from a very rural community, I'm here to provide a rural perspective this morning and talk about what I call a rural paradigm. So I'll share more later.
Great. Thank you, and hello, and good morning, everyone. I'm Colin Bailey again, Executive Director and Managing Attorney with the Environmental Justice Coalition for Water, otherwise known as EJCW. My background is as an anti-poverty attorney, having had some training also in organizing in labor and in the environment. The organization that I direct now is really a support network for a grassroots coalition, as the name suggests, in California that is many members strong. Our work entails everything from community organizing, capacity building, training, leadership development on the one prong, to litigation, legal advocacy, lobbying, all done through a grassroots model, and increasingly, to fill the gap between opportunity and the ability to take advantage of that opportunity, technical assistance for regional planning and project development, largely through collaboration with interdisciplinary teams. So with that, I'll pass it on to my colleagues, and we'll talk in more depth momentarily.
Omega Wilson, Western Revitalization Association, Mebane, North Carolina. First of all, I'd like to give honor, and it's always a privilege to be in the room with Dolly Burwell, who's peeping around in the back. Of course, a lot of you may or may not know that Dolly Burwell was the part of the heart and soul who started environmental justice in Warren County over 3 decades ago, and it's always a privilege to be in the room with her. I'd like to thank Reese for the invitation, and Danielle Purefoy, who's attorney Danielle Purefoy back there. Wave your hand, Danielle, right, for being here. And being on the panel again with Catherine. We made a lot of contacts over the last year as a result of Danielle's work. Our work broadens the definition of environmental justice to right to basic amenities. And we started that when we started our organization in 1994. Wow, 24 years ago this year. Because we thought looking at just the issue of water and sewer access wasn't enough, because the issues that bring it to our homes relates to so many different organizations and agencies. It deals with stormwater management. It deals with access to streets and roads in our community that had never been paved. Some of them in the city limits, and some houses still were used, some residents were still using outhouses in the city, even though they were paying city taxes for 35 years, because they were denied access to basic public health amenities, water suits, water streets, paved roads, a right to vote, a right to express themselves in city council meetings, because they were denied that access. And I'm not talking about 1940. I'm talking about a few years ago. So the access to basic amenities requires an interagency perspective, and that we learned when we filed a complaint with the United States Department of Justice in 1999, just to be able to get in a city council meeting and a county commissioner meeting in Alamance County, North Carolina, which is only a couple of counties over with. And this is not prehistoric history. This is not the 1800s. If you saw Lincoln, the movie Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, then it took us back to that period of time ideologically and socially among elected officials who were presidents of banks, who were attorneys, who graduated from Central University, who graduated from Carolina, and who graduated from Duke University. So intellectual power did not demonstrate public access and rights to basic amenities. We found that very early on. Culture became one of the biggest barriers we had to face. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just need some water, that's all.
Okay. And so now we'll jump into the questions that we have for the panelists. I'll ask that whoever feels the urge, jump in. You don't necessarily have to go in order. And we'll, after all of the questions are answered, we'll jump to the audience, and you all will be able to ask questions of the panelists. First question. So I'll preface with the acknowledgement that party affiliation does not automatically indicate one's compassion or dedication to environmental health and human health. But I will ask, how has the local political environment affected your community's approach to environmental justice? And for everyone in here, we're looking at 3 different states right now, and all of them have a national perspective and a local perspective as well. So we're thinking about the local level, the state level, and the national level. But right here, we're looking at Alabama, California, and North Carolina, two very different states, I mean, three very different states. We're all living under the same federal situation, so we can maybe all relate on that sphere. But I'm really interested to hear how the local political environment has impacted your work.
Well, I'll start. I think I'll start first since I'm from the state of Roy Moore.
Is that the new name?
But anyway, I think that in terms of my own political perspective, politically, I'm an independent. I've learned how to manipulate and move and bob and weave and pivot in a red state, a deeply red state. And it has been, interestingly enough, when I first started doing this in 2002, the people that were my allies were Republican, which made a lot of sense because the federal government at that time was Republican. I have the local officials in Alabama on the local level are all Democratic. But I think that because of the issue that I'm dealing with, raw sewage, that has been around for years, I think people, the shame that's also felt by people that are living in that condition is kind of exemplified by the way the local politicians have ignored that it even happens, even if they have raw sewage coming into their own homes. So we have not had a lot of success with local politicians. We've had to use the national media, national and international attention to get them to start paying attention. The people that I hear from most often about this are not from Alabama. But I can say lately, two people have reached out to me that are running for governor as Democrats, and they want to meet to talk about rural policy. And those persons are, I think, stand a good chance. Both of them stand a good chance, depending on who gets the nomination, to become governor of the state of Alabama, and the fact that they have an interest in this. But I had the opportunity to go to a fundraiser for Doug Jones, and I think that one of the problems that we have in dealing with these kinds of issues in rural communities, people want to focus on just the urban problems in this country, and they very seldom want to focus on those areas that are invisible, where we also have dirty plants, and we have a lot of these issues because they put them in our communities because we're so far from major media. But when I went to Doug Jones' event, it was a small setting, and after he made his pitch, I asked him, how are you going to deal with the problems in Lowndes County? Because it had just come out that we had done a parasite study and found evidence of tropical parasites, including hookworm, in Lowndes County. And Doug Jones' response to me was, I'm going to focus on the big problems. So the way I dealt with that, other than telling him a few things after that, was that I made sure that people that had Doug Jones' ear knew about this. And I got a text message from the person who is the deputy director of Senator Booker's office. Cory Booker has been a big supporter of ours, and he actually came down to Lowndes County. And I had told him about this. So right before the Saturday before the election that the whole nation was watching, I was invited to go to Alabama State University to hear Senator Booker there with Terry Sewell, who's a local congresswoman, and Doug Jones, who was a candidate at that time. So Cory Booker, being the smooth Cory Booker that he is, basically said, you know, Senator, when you get elected and you get to Washington, you're going to have to focus on the big things and the little things. He said, and when those water bills come before Congress, you're going to have to look at what is happening in places like Lowndes County, Alabama. Because until we deal with those kinds of issues, there is no justice in this country. So we have to, again, it goes back to what I originally said, you have to learn how to bob and weave and pivot. And although I could have written an op-ed piece against Doug Jones or highlighting what he said, I think it was smarter to deal with it the way that we did it. And last night, I was looking on where people could go to our website and sign up, and somebody from Doug Jones' office has signed up to get information on ACRE. That's a victory.
One of the first things that happened when we filed our complaint in Mebane, North Carolina in 1999, interesting context of culture again, is I received death threats for asking for water and sewer connections. It's interesting the cultural bias and cultural push from very intellectual and very smart people, like I mentioned before, who are bankers and attorneys, is just so dramatically strong and so vicious when people are asking for things that they already pay taxes for. That happened more than one time, by the way. I begin to get notes delivered by the chief of police in person. And I said, what in the world are you doing delivering the mail for the city? And he said, well, I'm just doing my job. And clearly, our board members and people in the community and I, of course, took this as intimidation. Sometimes the police would come by and just walk in the office and sit there for 45 minutes or an hour. And we said, well, is there anything you came for? I said, no, we just came to visit. So we'd give them coffee and we would talk. And of course, this went on for months and months and months. And people in the community wanted to know what in the world was going on in our office because the police would drive up, maybe more than one car. So the politics come out of these kinds of things because these employees who are not paid a lot of money would not do this unless the city council and the city attorney directed them to. We also had situations where we actually had to fight to get on the agenda to talk about our issues. And one way our comments were documented was because 2 or 3 newspapers in the area, one, the Mebane Enterprise, a weekly paper, and the other one, the Burlington Times, which is daily, printed the stories. But when we went back to look at the minutes, which we had access to, guess what we had said in the minutes? Nothing. We weren't even there. And the only time that changed is when we filed complaints with the United States Department of Justice again. So in order to get the city council, county commissioners to actually move to even address us as if we existed was by filing complaints with the United States Department of Justice. When we talked to our local representatives at the state legislature, they refused to talk to us. One Democratic official who represented our immediate area told me that I need to mind my business and get back to selling insurance. I have been an insurance broker since recently retired for 30-some years. So our office, our insurance office, we made it the insurance office for Omega Wilson Insurance and also the office of the Western Revitalization Association at the same time. So we were doing this dual dynamic, my wife and I. But one of the things that's interesting about this whole process is when we had attorneys come to our meetings to document what was going on, one of those, the Land Loss Prevention Project, which is right here in Durham, North Carolina, Savvy Horn, one of our sons now, Attorney Amora Wilson works for that law firm now. The city officials told them to get out and go back to Durham and mind their own business, right? So politics covers a whole lot of things, and people who are not quote unquote elected but hired responded to us based on, as they would say, I am just doing my job. Fire marshals did things. I am just doing my job. I'm doing what I'm told to do based on what the city council and the mayor told me to do. So it cannot be relegated just to the elected officials. And it was interesting that at some point in time, we started to be invited as a result of a number of articles. When we filed a civil rights complaint, by the way, in 1999, it eventually wound up on the front page of the Raleigh News and Observer. It was supposed to be a plug-in bullet article in Section 5, but when the reporters were sent to investigate and take pictures, the editor looked at the article and sent 2 different crews back to take pictures, and it wound up from the 5th section to the 2nd section. When they got through editing it, it was a front page story on the front page of the Raleigh News and Observer. And that copy of the newspaper was distributed to state legislature, to everybody, and also to our elected officials in Washington, D.C. That's how we wind up getting national visibility. But the places we were invited to talk and speak about it were not Duke, they were not Carolina, they were not A&T, they were not North Carolina Central University, they were San Francisco, they were in Atlanta, they were in Jacksonville, Florida, they were in Boston, they were in Toronto, they were in Vancouver, Canada. Places so far away because people in our local community said we were troublemakers. We were too radical to even speak in our own county, in our own state. All of that is connected to politics, and all of it's a frightening indictment still of this state. And I won't speak for the other states, but that feeling still has not been washed away in our community. We still feel it. My wife and I still feel it, and we still see it on a daily basis.
Yeah, please. Thank you. So I was told this was going to be very conversational, so I shelved a whole PowerPoint. But there is a little video that I want to show you that'll give some insight, I think, into the campaign in California for the human right to water. Before I go that direction, though, I want to mention, oh, we just lost the video on this one. It's coming back. Oh, no, it's not coming back. We have to see what we can get up here.
Yep, it's up there.
It's up there, it's just not down here.
That in speaking with Catherine before, including yesterday evening, oh, perfect. I think so. We'll get that going momentarily. There are tremendous parallels in what I've just heard from you, Omega, as well, that I think we'll want to explore that effectively shape the theme of violence and threat against Black lives for doing this work. It's something that I have the privilege not to have faced, which I think is worthy of examination, although in the case that was mentioned earlier, we did have one of my colleagues who was an organizer in an African-American community, African-American herself, had her home broken into, and the only things that went missing were her laptop and all of the papers on the case. So we were watching our backs at that point. But as to California, I'm going to focus my comments briefly at the state level, which is primarily the valence at which our organization works. And I'll do it by way of introduction of this 2-minute video.
A history of water concerns has plagued a small town in the South Valley.
California's agricultural core is contaminated
Cleaning up the drinking water in a problematic area.
Systems that don't have access to safe drinking water and non-clean
Water
with
problems.
sand, nitrates, and other
chemicals. With a
chemicals.
compound that has been linked to cancer, and the problem is only going to get worse.
We have found lead, arsenic, perchlorate. Everywhere that we go, we find something.
There's high concentrations of nitrates, and there's trichloropropane.
People get sick, gastrointestinal problems, nervous system problems, problems with their skin.
I noticed after the shower, bundles of hair would just fall off.
We have to go out and buy water for cooking, for drinking.
There's people that are spending 15–20% of their income on just water.
I've got a small basket here.
It's virtually impossible to find clean drinking water here.
This is not a privilege. This is a humane thing. People should have good water.
Water is a human right.
El agua es un derecho humano.
Water is a human right.
About having a human right to water bill for all of California.
We faced huge opposition from very powerful influences in California.
I urge a no vote.
I respectfully oppose this bill.
I request a no vote.
When you get communities to come together, there's a lot of power in that.
Low-income communities and tribal communities.
Giving up was not an option. It was now or never.
So I wanted to show that quickly because, among other things, it shows the breadth of diversity of the water issues in California, just from a drinking water perspective, of which there are many, many others. Let's see, how do I pause? Should be familiar with YouTube. All right. Only my 6-year-old were here. I'm acutely aware when I travel outside of California to talk about what we are doing in California that there are things that we are told we can do that just aren't possible in other places. Perhaps as one example, I should say the punchline. So after a 4.5-year campaign, California in 2012 became the first state in the nation to adopt by legislative means a human right to water policy, which states fairly simply and elegantly that it's the policy of the state of California that every human has a right to safe, clean, affordable, and accessible water for drinking, sanitation, and hygiene. That law is then required of every state agency, notably not local water agencies, but every state agency when certain triggering events occur, whether they're drafting eligibility guidelines for state programs, revising guidelines, policies, or regulations. We've since tried to amplify that through our administrative advocacy, and I can talk about that a little bit more. What I wanted to mention is that we've been able to drive priorities in a big way because of that change of frame around the human right in California. We've been able to drive dollars. The main infrastructure dollars come from general obligation bonds, of which in the current round, Proposition 1 passed in 2014 in the midst of a historic drought. We are working with $51 million statewide specifically for capacity building and involving disadvantaged communities. That's the state's lingo for communities under 80% of the statewide median household income in integrated regional water management, kind of the state's preferred model for regional planning for project development. I'll try not to get too heavy on the acronyms. My own organization is working with well over $6.5 million of that, which is a huge thing. California is really a tale of two states, however. For anyone who's spent any time there, you have an extraordinary number of progressive and centrists in the legislature, and then as soon as you get to the interior of the state, you'll encounter what's called the state of Jefferson, which is a nearly 70-year-old secessionist movement. Some of the highest rates of passage, or rather votes for Trump, were actually in California's eastern and northern counties, which has that polarity has really important impacts on our work. Notwithstanding the passage of the human right to water, which I would say was predicated on, in part, the maturation of the environmental justice movement in California, wherein we hit a sweet spot in time, where some founders of the Environmental Justice Coalition for Water were at the points in their career that they were well-positioned and became the closest advisors to incoming Governor Brown during his first few years. He, as a native Californian, was struck by, he needed to be educated, and we had someone right there in his ear. He was shocked to find the immorality and unethical fact that in a state of 40 million people, by the state's own estimates, upwards of between 1 and 2 million people do not have access to safe, clean water. When you look at affordability and sanitation, which are far less well known from a statistical perspective, the numbers are far greater. So he was personally educated and outraged, and I think it hurt his pride in the state. This was in the midst of a recession. We had the United Nations come and visit during that critical time in 2011. There was a famous photo taken from a levee in Sacramento of a homeless encampment in 1920, I want to say 9, by Dorothea Lange. And there was an enterprising Sacramento Bee reporter who took that exact same picture, which almost looked identical in 2011. That helped to elevate the issue, not just for homeless people, but as the bill itself, Assembly Bill 685, the Human Right to Water bill, was sitting and languishing in the legislature. It had been set on the Senate Appropriations Committee suspense file, which is where all good bills go to die. And the community, the statewide campaign rallied. Folks came up from California's Central Valley, from all over California, combined a bunch of their own actual tap water into what they called the Central Valley Blend, put it in little labeled containers, took it to every single legislator and said, if you don't want to pass the human right to water, then have a drink of this. And that bill, on the last moment possible, popped off of the suspense file, which was actually critical to its passage, because by virtue of doing that, the opposition, mainly large water agencies who feared that this was going to unleash a regime of providing free water and lack of accountability, et cetera, a bunch of straw man arguments, they had no ability to oppose it. So it went to the Senate floor where, again, California's dynamic landscape, we had a Central Valley representative who was in the heart of where the contamination and the harm is the worst for low-income communities of color, primarily farm worker communities, who had said he was going to vote for it, but then he disappeared off the floor as the vote was being taken. So folks went into action, they started texting, they called his office, and they said, we're watching you, we're expecting you to be a leader. He walked in at the last possible moment and cast the passing vote. Came out only months later that he was also, at the time, he was chairing the Senate Environmental Quality Committee, negotiating the terms of his hire with none other than Chevron Corporation to be their lead lobbyist. So that's California in a nutshell for you. I'll mention that the landscape has changed a bit, and this was very intentional by big business corporations. They brought out a statewide initiative, a proposition that made it so that the runoff in every state election, statewide office election, it's not by party now, so that the top 2 vote getters, which are often people running as Democrats, move into the runoff. And that was very intentional because now you have this huge lens of nominal Democrats who are very business friendly, and it's made the legislature much more conservative because they're running that centrist line. And I dare say that were we to try to run the Human Right to Water bill today, it may face a different fate.
Thank you all. And I think that I heard 2 big overarching themes from this, and that is politics does play a role locally on the state level and in some instances nationally. And you know, who we think are our allies are not always our allies. We can be disappointed by the disregard for the small issues, local issues, but as we've seen with Flint, Michigan, and all of the topics that were brought up here, the small issues can very quickly become national headlines, and it would behoove our leaders and decision makers to pay attention when they're asked. And also, I think that the power of community and alliances and the power of working together is really strong and is something that should not be overlooked in this work. And so that leads me into the next question I have. What role has the impacted community played in addressing this injustice? And so I heard examples of this throughout what you all were saying, you know, addressing intimidation tactics and, you know, dealing with the fact that our elected leaders fail us and regulators can fail us sometimes. And so, you know, how has the community really been involved in moving your initiatives forward? And I have a follow-up question to that if there's time, but if you could all take a few minutes and address that, thank you.
Well, our community has been involved by giving voice to the problem. The problem that I deal with as it relates to raw sewage, one cannot understand it unless you visit the homes of the people that are impacted. So it's been those few brave souls that have invited people into their homes. And let me kind of back up a bit. I come from a tradition. My parents were very involved in the civil rights movement from the perspective of SNCC in rural communities, and I learned from them that there has to be relationship building, and I've learned from them about grassroots organizing, and sometimes grassroots organizing just involves sitting on somebody's porch and listening to them. So what has been very, very helpful in understanding this, even me being a native of Lowndes County, you know, we went from cesspools to septic tanks, but I really didn't understand that the conditions were so horrific and how things had changed, because the narrative that the Alabama Department of Public Health was promoting was that the reason that people were straight piping, which is flushing their toilets and it goes out a pipe on top of the ground outside their homes, the reason they were straight piping was because they could not afford on-site septic systems, and the solution was getting money to put in septic tanks for everybody. Well, we found out that wasn't the case, and the only way we found out that wasn't the case was by listening to people who were actually living in those situations, because what they were telling us was counter to what the official narrative was. And actually, they're still promoting that same narrative now. But as you go and you see firsthand, and that's what people have been doing, even when Senator Booker came, and we're now hearing that Reverend Barber wants to come and see it firsthand, although it's here in North Carolina too. But I think that the fact that the community is giving voice to the problems by allowing folk to come into their homes and see it firsthand and answer questions that most people don't want to answer. How many of you would let somebody in your home to talk about how your bathroom is working? How can you tell when the raw sewage is running back into your home? How does it affect your life when it comes back into your home? How many insurance claims that you have to file? Because some people have had to file insurance claims because if they happen to have the misfortune of being away from home for hours at a time while this is going on, or at work, they come home and it's all over their homes. We've gone into homes where people have told us they've removed the carpet. You know, who can imagine that in the United States of America, that it is so bad, that the infrastructure is so flawed, and people are forced to use it under the force of criminalization, because in Alabama, if you have a failing septic system, you can be charged up to $500 a day and be charged with a misdemeanor, and people have been charged. But the same people that are bringing the charges are the ones that say you have to use this flawed technology, and there's no accountability for that, and they put all the onus on the homeowner. So in our case, had it not been for listening, developing those listening skills, and being able, because I live in Montgomery, although I grew up in Lowndes County, and I'm on a municipal system that, as far as I know, is working fairly well from my own perspective. But to go into Lowndes County and to be able to spend time and listen, and that's one of the things that I learned as I was growing up, and that's one of the things that's come out of the partnership with Duke University, is that students have learned to go into the communities and listen. You know, sometimes we go in with our own narrative and we try to make it fit, but I think in order to be able to solve these kinds of problems, we need to listen to the indigenous knowledge of those communities, and they can provide us with a lot of the answers we need to pursue.
I'd like to dovetail what Catherine has said, just not repeat, but one of the things that we found when we first started our organization, we started based on what we call pity parties. And my wife and I, Brenda, she and I, when we first moved here, we'd have dinners with some relatives. I was born and raised in Mebane. She was born and raised in Philadelphia. And one of the things that we would do is have dinner with some of our family and friends that we hadn't been in contact with years, or anniversary parties or whatever it was, you know. And after about the fourth time, we realized that after 30 minutes of talking how good it is to see you and how the children, how the grandbabies doing, how's your mama and how the aunt so-and-so. We'd always revert back to what was wrong with our community. And we said, wow, we just can't get away from this thing. So we decided to start an organization in 1994, October 1994. And when we started it, not long after we started, we had to call people together. We used to have meetings with 100 and some people in it. And we didn't, wow, people would come in angry. They were so angry we couldn't follow the agenda because it was pent up, you know. And we said, good gracious. So then the word got around that some low-income white relatives contacted us, and they wanted us to present their story, but they were afraid to because they didn't want to be beat up like the black folks were beat up. And I said, what? We were invited to a church to talk to them, but they refused to come out publicly. And I said, my goodness, this is terrible. Then, of course, part of our community is Native American, Okanichi-Saponi. And there's an office right downtown in Mebane. And a lot of those people are friends and family that I went to school with. And I'm all a part of those communities, white, African American, and Native American. From Bassett's Mountain is part of where my bloodstream comes from, and part of the other Native American bloodstream came from Cherokee in the mountains of North Carolina. So one of the things that we did is I have relatives in West End, I have relatives in White Level, Buckhorn, I have relatives in other parts, in African American communities in and around Mebane, and there are 5 major ones. And when we started, some of the other community people through churches and stuff like that heard about what we were doing. The organization was named West End because that's where we started. We were going to do some work with just 2 or 3 blocks. And some of the other groups, communities said, well, can we join your group from White Level? Can we join your group from Buckhorn, Perry Hill? So we said yes. We set up the board that way. And what we decided to do is find people in those different communities to be what you might call block captains. Some of them were deacons in their churches who were respected, because I'm a relative of some of those people, but it's just interesting if you go to another community and knock on somebody's door, even if they're their cousins, they look at you and say, who died? What's wrong? You know, because you're not a part of that immediate community. So when they see you moving around, they get a little bit curious and maybe a little uneasy because they don't see you every day. They see you on Sunday at a funeral or family reunion. So we set it up so we have community monitors. And when we start having water tested by the virology lab at Carolina, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, the other blue, we had people from those communities actually collect water samples from stream water and spigot water in people's houses. And the ones that didn't want us to let us in the house, as Catherine said, we got spigot water from outside. And we had to test it. But the people who collected the water were people from those individual communities. Because when Herman knocked on the door, or John Cousins knocked on the door, or Rachel Hester knocked on the door, they said, hey, Rachel, what's going on? We're having a church meeting tonight. Said, no, I'm coming to collect your water. So it was easy for them to respond to it. So that's one of the ways we got the community people involved, because they had an immediate interest based on people they know, people in the community who were part of our board, and they wanted to be involved based on somebody they knew and somebody they trusted. Because one time we sent some students from Carolina, still who we know, who are now PhDs at Johns Hopkins University and Texas A&M, who were graduate students like some of the people maybe in this room. They're professors and that kind of stuff now and run all kind of programs. When they went to the door to ask people for water, some of them black, some of them white, one lady asked her son to come to the door with the gun. I don't know you, get off my porch. So, you know, people, I don't know who you are. I don't trust you. I've never seen you before. You come asking for water? So we had to understand the dynamics of how you deal with communities, even though we trusted them as a board, even though we had met with them several times, the local community had no idea who they were. So we had to set that up in a way that it worked for the community, and we developed trust on a long-term and ongoing basis.
All right. Well, thank you, and I echo the comments of my colleagues. In answer to the question, what is the role of impacted communities? Impacted communities are central to the Environmental Justice Coalition for Water, to our theory of change. It was impacted communities who came together first in 1999 to form EJCW. And to this day, our board is comprised at least by half of people who are representative of the membership from the most grassroots level. It's hard to summarize the roles because they're so varied in our work statewide. Again, California's 40 million people. We have impacted communities are absolutely central to identifying the problems in the communities as well as the solutions, acting as the spokespersons and the communicators, the advocates, whether it's at the state level or regional or local government level. We've, in the last 5 years, been very active on community-based participatory research, which posits community members as co-equals in the investigation of knowledge. And of course, that knowledge has a purpose. And I mentioned already the regional planning processes, which are very much done through a community-based process. I will mention that as a statewide umbrella organization, I do see the benefit of institutions like ours in aiding the involvement of directly impacted communities as facilitating a forum for discussion for the development of collective vision and strategy, especially when the interests and the forums for advocacy are so varied. Also as a resource aggregator, you heard some of the discussion earlier from me about how we've been able to push the priorities and the dollars at the state level, but we have to be able to funnel those into chewable bites and build capacity at the directly impacted community level so that those opportunities can actually be taken advantage of. There is this tension in that role, I think, that I've seen particularly in California, but also other places, between the role of directly impacted communities and kind of the professionalization of the environmental justice movement, of which I am a part, and in some ways the way in which the nonprofit industrial complex and some of the challenges around running an institution that runs very leanly can at times feel like they're in tension with a truly grassroots model. And we try very hard to reconcile those. Where am I going to say here? We work a lot, since it's so big, with intermediary organizations, of which there are many in many parts of California. You know, the San Francisco Bay Area, Los Angeles are among the most civic organization-rich places probably in the world. And there are other places of California where that's very much not the case. But it's an organizer's mantra that it's always easier to organize those who are already organized. And currently, as coalitions are always in a process of making and remaking themselves through the statewide program to involve disadvantaged communities in integrated regional water management planning that I mentioned earlier, we're trying to leverage that as much as possible to reach new communities at the deepest grassroots level and working through some non-traditional allies in that. In fact, working very hard with a lot of local water agencies to undertake a community-based process themselves in hopes that we can actually use that as a recruitment tool for our own purposes and grow the body as power ultimately comes down to organized people and organized money.
Thank you. So what I'm hearing, and I think that we can all carry this with us through our various parts of this work, is that relationship building with impacted communities is essential. Trust building, understanding dynamics of the community you are entering into is extremely important, and becoming a listener and having kind of the ability to set aside your intentions when entering into a community and really being able to hear what the issues are and what the problems are and moving forward in partnership with a community that you're trying to help. So for the sake of time, I'm going to jump into the last question. And Brother Omega, there you go. The last question is, are there examples within your work of effective relationships between community members, experts, and regulators, elected officials, decision makers? Have there been effective, real examples that you can pull from that everyone in here can take with them and go back home and say, this is how I'm going to move forward, or try to replicate that you would like to share today? And before you begin, I'd encourage everyone in about 10 minutes, we're going to begin question and answer, and be thinking about, things you're hearing here that you want to dig a little deeper into, and really kind of pull those pieces out as they're talking. So I'll start with Catherine.
Well, we've had a number of successful partnerships. The most successful partnership has been with Duke University, the Franklin Humanities Institute here at Duke, as well as the Nick School, and the other areas throughout the campus where students have been working with us. We have upwards of 20 students working on various aspects of the issues that we're dealing with in Lowndes County. And without that, it would not allow us to have the time or the expertise to expand the capacity of the organization, because along with all of this work that we're doing, our end goal, our end game is to find solutions to the problem, not to keep talking about it for the next 20 or 30 years. So out of that, young people are engaged in helping us develop policy. And to give you an example, in March, we're having a meeting in Washington. We had several members that are working with us from Duke that met with Senator Booker just before Christmas. And we talked about this plan of bringing together all these collaborators. Some of our collaborators are in the audience. We have with us the Human Rights Law Clinic that's represented by Joanne Ward from Columbia University. And also Dr. Inga Winkler. And the reason why I wanted to mention Inga is because Inga was the legal advisor to the Special Rapporteur on water and sanitation. We were coming from a small place like Lowndes County. I'm just sometimes in awe of how the Divine One has connected us to all of these people that I otherwise never would have known, but because of their leadership, we wrote the letter to the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights that allowed him, that invited him to come to Alabama. And when he came to Alabama, he was able to see firsthand, by visiting the homes of people, see firsthand what was going on there. And as a result, we're not only getting national but international attention about extreme poverty here in the United States that people didn't even know exists. And we were doing this around water and sanitation. So those partnerships that we've been able to leverage, I don't know whether people from Eco Justice or Earth Justice are here. They've worked with us. So what has been very, very helpful to our movement, because I started doing this work in 2002, like you, Omega, went back home and saw that things hadn't changed. Actually, when I left home, people were using outhouses. And they might as well use outhouses now, because at least then it wasn't coming back into the house. So that is, and in the beginning, the kinds of things I was told, this was not sexy, people don't want to hear about this, all the kinds of things that people have said, and it's taken this long for people to understand. But I guess when you have somebody in the White House who's orange and also use the term S-holes to describe other countries when we have them existing here in this country. So I believe that, because I think we have to keep humor in this work sometimes to keep going when you're getting the death threats and all that other stuff. But we have to, but the partnerships that we have been able to leverage have been in the best interest of the community, because it has given voice. And later I'll talk about during my keynote, I'll talk about our relationship with Baylor and how that particular, that partnership really put us on the map as it relates to combining science that this administration pretends like does not exist, science and climate change, to show the impact that it's having on communities in Alabama. And I think that the lesson to be learned there is that these kinds of templates can be applied in other places as well.
Our most recent partnership is with the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. And there's a representative here who's in charge of Title VI and some environmental justice work, Sarah Rice. If you raise your hand or either stand. Right. With Secretary Michael Regan for DEQ, and they were participants in the first statewide North Carolina Environmental Justice Solutions workshop that we had in Mebane, March of 2017, with people from various parts of the state and out of state. But what created that activity was, after I mentioned earlier that we couldn't get anybody's door in North Carolina, including our own elected officials, when we first started this. But our partnerships developed between, as a result of students actually dragging us in class at the resentment of some college professors at Carolina at the School of Public Health. Some students dragging us in class as a part of their assignment at the resentment of professors at City and Regional Planning in Carolina, and also at Duke University many years ago, where students were invited to do projects to speak on us, about us. But some of the students were pretty wise. Rather than doing that, they would bring us to class. It was, you know, of course, their issue was, why does the professor don't want you here? So they were kind of putting themselves on the line with some of these. But as a part of this, we've developed a relationship with North Carolina Central University. In fact, about 3 or 4 years ago, we were invited to be on a panel with Elaine Chiasso of Harvard Assembly. A lot of you know her. And to be a part of their first initiation of the Environmental Justice Symposium there. And we've been back more than once. And of course, we also had a chance to be a part of the Environmental Justice Law Clinic at Yale University. Attorney Marian Ingamolato is back there. Wave your hand, Marian. She came all the way from Yale here. So we've worked with her, and the list has grown, and we were invited to be a part of the policy recommendation for President Obama when he first came to office in 2008, when he was elected. 2 weeks after he was elected, I got a phone call from a young lady who was inviting me to come to Washington to present recommendations based on the water sewer issues that we had raised, because I had become a member of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council for EPA. And I hung the phone up because I thought it was somebody playing around. And they called back a couple of days later, and we had a staff person who answered the phone. And I had told her about the call, and she said, "Mr. Wilson, you need to answer this phone because there's not some children playing around on the phone." And I answered it, and they said, "You need to be in Washington in 2 weeks." And I wrote a list of recommendations. There were 10, and they were summarized and published in an article by the North Carolina Medical Journal, because they wanted me to document some of this information for the medical profession, because the bottom line of this is health. And I said, "This is a medical journal for medical professionals." They said, "That's all right. You're a community person, and they don't know how to say what you're saying." That was in 2011, and they asked me to write it basically from the point of view of a commentary, quote unquote, not a scientific presentation, and identify some of the issues in some of the communities we work with these kind of issues, And of course, one of them was West End. Another one was a place called Rogers Eubanks Road area in Chapel Hill Carver area with Reverend Campbell and the police officer Caldwell, David Caldwell. And the other was Reach in Duplin County with Devon Hall, and at that time, the Thula Hall, and Reach with the hog farm issues. A lot of people see hog farm issues, but they don't understand that the contaminants from the hog farm contaminates well water, contaminates stream water, right? So the water connection was easy. So that was a part of the article that I was asked to write, to actually try to educate some medical professionals, and it was published and distributed to over 30,000 medical professionals in and out of the state of North Carolina, to try to get them to realize some of the things that are coming in their offices and in their clinics, and their patients who are coming in with various kinds of E. coli infections and lead infections, that they need to be responsive, not only just to listen to the patient, but report it back to public health officials, which most doctors do not do, even though it's in the guidebook. When a child, it looks like somebody has been abused, from domestic abuse or child abuse or poison, they're supposed to report it back to the health department. But we found out that that wasn't happening. So developing this network turned out to be much, much broader and much more intricate. And of course, it's called interagency. And I worked on an interagency advisory committee for the United States government as a part of the Federal Advisory Committee Act for the federal government under EPA, to try to encourage interagency reaction to corrective action, rather than just looking at it from DEQ or DENA, which used to be DENA in North Carolina, or just EPA's responsibility. It's the responsibility of every federal agency that receives federal money. It's responsibility of every county agency that receives a dime of your tax money. It's the legal responsibility of every city that receives a penny of your tax money. And that's an issue that we've driven for years and years and years. And of course, we've had a struggle to get local communities, students, professors, doctors, lawyers, et cetera, to understand that EPA is not the only organization that has legal responsibility, which our esteemed friend and colleague, Attorney Jamie Cole, knows very well.
So the number of effective relationships between affected communities and decision makers in our work is quite varied. I'll just rattle off a few that I think will be of interest. As I mentioned before, the Human Right to Water bill in 2012 passed by almost an impossibly narrow. We couldn't replicate those circumstances if we tried again, because they'd be on the watch for them. But under Governor Brown's administration, I think we experienced and are still at the latter stages of a bit of a renaissance in terms of the receptivity of the state administrative bodies to environmental justice and tribal justice arguments, most especially at the State Water Board, which is, of all the state agencies, the most publicly accessible because of its public board meetings. In that context, the Assembly Bill 685, the Human Right to Water bill, took a lot of hits in committee that narrowed its scope. I mentioned it's only addressed to state agencies and not local agencies, which is a big kind of missing area. And so in an effort to try to reach lower and start to attach conditions consistent with the human right to water policy to, for example, the receipt of state funding, we've worked very closely with the State Water Board staff, with their attorneys, and with board members themselves, some of whom I consider to be probably the most human rights and environmental justice focused advocates in those particular positions in the history of California at this moment, to craft a resolution that was passed last year in February, expanding the human right to water and its consideration in all of the State Water Board's work, including expressly their water rights administration. which gave rise to the opportunity now for our organization to be the first environmental justice organization in 105 years of water rights administration in California to be an official party to a water rights proceeding. So that door was opened right at that time, and I think a good example of making sure that EJ interests were not simply swept off the table for lack of standing, as had been the case for the prior century. A second example is less decision makers, but since you both mentioned kind of the academic context, we work with no fewer than a dozen universities in California. It's a very rich university environment, and we're very privileged to have those opportunities. Among them, we worked, in fact, Catherine was part of this effort at the national level, worked with the UC Berkeley International Human Rights Law Clinic and the International Human Rights Law Clinic at Santa Clara University to prepare a national hearing before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. That was the first of its kind in 2016? Yes. We've worked with Golden Gate University and Stanford's Environmental Law Clinic on litigation in the state, which we as a small shop wouldn't be able to undertake, but through that partnership. We've worked with UC Davis and other groups on community-based participatory research. One recent one, which Danielle, I'll very much want to speak with you about, in the San Joaquin Valley, looking expressly at access to water and sanitation for disadvantaged unincorporated communities, which have a long history there in relation to the economy, the agricultural economy, and the formation of race and disadvantage through the manipulation of water and access to it. Finally, I'll mention, and this should sound familiar, of that $51 million that we and our allies were successful in getting into the last bond, specifically for disadvantaged communities and their involvement in regional planning, water planning. We knew that we had to be in the right place at the right time, so we kind of raised our elbows a little bit and jostled with a lot of the consultants who have made their careers off of working for agencies and being at the intersection of the dollars meant for the ostensibly for the benefit of disadvantaged communities. And of the 12 funding areas in the state for those dollars, EJCW is the only non-governmental organization to serve as both the grant administrator and the program director. Every other one is directed by, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power and the big behemoths. So we're in a really exciting place at the early stages of that $6.5 million regional program to collaborate with the other big guys, the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, the Santa Clara Valley Water District, East Bay Mud, all these guys who traditionally have occupied that space to the exclusion of EJ communities. Now we're there, and we're creating space for our colleagues and allies at the grassroots level, which we think will be a good collaboration going forward.
Please join me in thanking our three panelists. This has been awesome. Thank you so much for answering those questions. And I think that, we can take several lessons from everything you've been saying. I'm sure there are plenty of follow-up conversations that could happen today. But we have about 20 minutes for question and answer. So if you all are ready, we will open it up to the audience to ask questions. So I'm going to point to folks in the order I saw you over here.
Hi, everybody. I'm Arden Rowell. I'm a law professor. I teach environmental law here this semester, normally back in Illinois. So thank you all for your work, your comments. This was great. Thank you to the organizers for this event. So I tend to think that one of the great challenges in environmental justice is that it asks people to think about social conditions that they find upsetting or even repellent, so unfair, racist distributions of risk, inhumane conditions in our own communities. I also think that the particular topics that you all are struggling with have a doubly difficult challenge. So raw sewage in people's homes, or poisonous drinking water, or lack of toilet access, those are things that people might psychologically recoil from, even if they don't have a racist or an unjust backdrop. So I guess my question is, how do you deal with the challenge of people recoiling from your work? Do you see your role partly as normalizing discussion of very hard things, or is it the opposite? Do you see your role as shocking rather than normalizing? Do you see your role as holding up a mirror for difficult truths, and if so, to whom? Who is it that you want to be looking into that mirror? Or is it just an entirely different a model that you see your work falling into? So maybe using legal tools to force response to issues that politics would recoil from. So question is, how do you think about, how do you deal with people recoiling from the important work that you do?
I would like to point out something and an organization that a lot of you know about, which has helped address what you're talking about, and that's the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network that Jamie Cole and I are part of, and Danielle and my wife. And I don't know how many people in the room in Dolly Burwell are going to raise your hand if you've been attended or worked with. Okay, so quite a few people, right, and including Marianne. One of the things that organization has done, and one of our twin sons is co-director of it in the last few years, and Naima Muhammad, I think, was not going to be able to be here today. I spoke with her last night, and she has the flu, and she wanted to say hello to all of you. She was one of the founders of the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. But what it did, it created an audience, a big audience, sometimes well over 100 people, sometimes from as many as 17 states, you know, up and down the coast and the Midwest, who would come to various meetings. And those meetings, even though the issue dealt with disparities related to low-income and tribal communities, African-American communities, the audience was always very diverse, of tribal communities, Hispanic families, Asian communities, people from India, various African-American people. So that was one way. And there were students there from all over the place, college students, people finishing their master's degrees, or actually documenting the conversation to write articles for PhDs and dissertations. And one of the giants that's appeared in that audience most recently is Danielle Purifoy, who brought our story and Catherine's story to an exhibit that was held over 3 months at at Duke University to actually put a three-dimensional picture with an artist from New York on it. So what happened in this process, it had pictures of people who were in the part of the community, they were interviewed, and it had some maps on the wall that identified it, and it had art, because what Danielle wanted to do and Takwasi Dyson wanted to do from New York is create a language that was more transitional, and it addressed the issue that you talked about, where some people may have been repulsed by looking at a container of fecal coliform or three-dimensional human waste in a jar. And I see some of you frowning right now like you want to upchuck. But some folks like to look at those pie charts. You know, they look, you know, many professors we work with want to look at the pie charts. And of course, when you got to the art part of it, it was another kind of sensitivity in your brain. When you look at things that you look at the subject from a distance, but you're close to it because it's spoken in a language that doesn't make your stomach roll over. But that's part of it. And that's evolved over 20-some years, because we took some of the people from the EPA on a tour of our community, scientists, a busload of them, 18, several years ago, over 10 years ago. And guess what they did not want us to do? They demanded we not take them to the sewage treatment plant because they didn't want to smell it and see it. And I said, damn, right? Because they were laboratory scientists. They were not field scientists. And I didn't understand the difference. They dealt with computers, they dealt with images, they did with fecal coliform on a computer screen. They could see it, microscopically enhanced. And they looked at sewage treatment plants with pictures, high definition, but they didn't want to smell it. And some ladies made sure that I understood that they had just got their hair done, and that smell would be in their hair when they went home. They were very clear. These are professional people from EPA who were supposed to be protecting us, and they were concerned about the aesthetic. Go home and wash your clothes and wash your hair and take a bath after you get through. These people we're dealing with have to deal with it every day. That's part of the drama we have to deal with when we bring people to the community to address the issue, to correct it. The people on the front line don't want to be on the front line. So your question is a great question.
Quickly, I guess one of the examples that I can share is that I think that Flint and Standing Rock help people to understand that water is life, and none of us can live without it. So because it's so essential to life on Earth, I think that what we had to do was show those parallels. And what I've done is not only just try to articulate, what's there in the community, but I've also connected it to other struggles. And that's why I thought it was important to go to Flint. Although a lot of people in Flint are probably from places like Lowndes County because of the Great Migration. There's a connection. And I also saw the need to go to Standing Rock because there's a connection there as well. So I think in terms of trying to connect all these movements and helping people to understand how essential water is and how these are certain, sanitation is something that we all have to deal with. And I think that in that issue, we may have something that is unifying, because when we deal with a lot of these other issues, people, they either side on one side of the issue or one side of the other, but Scott Pruitt has to go to the bathroom too. So I think that we can make it real to others. And although it's taken a long time to get there, I think now that the media has recognized that the United States, most of it is rural, not urban, and also given us some attention, I think that we are in a place now where more people are interested, and a lot of people are coming forward, and we've given them permission. There are folk, a lot of people are benefiting from what the EJ community is doing because they're having the same problem. It's just like those folk that didn't want to speak out, but they wanted you to speak out. We get that too, where people are calling us and say that we're happy that you're doing this because this was my experience, but they don't feel free enough yet to share it. So, so I think that in terms of how we do this and get people to hear us, and it's basically, in our case, is connecting to other movements as well. And we're part of, Colin and I like to take the liberty to invite Omega to become part of the National Coalition for the Human Right to Water and Sanitation. And as part of that group, and we represent entities from around the United States, including people in Flint and people in Detroit that are fighting water affordability issues, people in Arizona whose water has been poisoned by uranium mining. So those kinds of things are very, very important in terms of us seeing the connectivity, because at the end of the day, these water issues that we're fighting, and I'm going to talk about it more in my keynote, these water issues that we are fighting are issues that are going to impact all of us, because there are entities like Monsanto, and I hope they're not contributors to Duke, but I'm going to call them out today. There's Big Ag in California. There's Nestle. They want to control the water. They want to monetize it, and they're going to make all of us pay for it. And these people have no conscience. You either get it or you don't, and without it, we can't live. And that's what Standing Rock taught us.
Yeah, and watch out for the federal infrastructure bill and the pathway it might pave for privatization. quickly, in response to your question, I actually want to take it a little bit more broadly, because I don't think it's actually the substance of the work in the field that is the challenge with respect to the social conditions people find repellent. I was listening to Dr. John Powell, who was over at the UC Berkeley Haas Institute for Social Inclusion, and the data, despite our kind of national narrative that elevates the rags to riches type story, Americans have a uniquely sour view of the poor. I mean, just they're considered dim-witted, they're considered less than. There were actually theories coming out of the 1800s and early 1900s combined with eugenics about how they're actually different species, a different genetic. I mean, there are all sorts of things that are lingering in our national psyche in the backs of our minds that are built into the landscape, and they're largely unconscious unless you raise them to the conscious level, which is one of the strategies that we very much try to do. And it gets even more challenging in that respect when you bring racial justice into the fold, because you have, I don't know if folks know, John and Kathleen Hansen from Harvard wrote an article many years ago called The Blame Frame, examining the national narrative that was used after the impacts of Katrina, and how the narrative started to shift towards, well, people were told that they should evacuate, right? That was a shift. That was Wolf Blitzer on day 2 at 4:03 p.m. The frame started to shift towards choice and personal responsibility, which is yet another blame frame that says that all people's lived circumstances are the product of their own making, and so we are absolved of the responsibility to act on behalf. And then you look at things like Dr. Jennifer Eberhard at Stanford. Her research into unconscious bias shows that the typical person, and this is overwhelmingly so, and irrespective of race, actually has some embedded notions that she describes holistically as the darker one's skin, the more degraded the space is. And it's a sickly way of thinking, but it's embedded in our thinking. I mean, she's actually tested this empirically. There's actually this unconscious sense among most folks that the darker your skin, the more toxins you can actually absorb and be okay. It is extraordinarily perverse, but it's part of the psyche that we have to understand in order to unwork the structures that continue to oppress. And so, what do we do about that? Dr. Powell talks about there's a lot of bridge breaking going on right now. We need a lot more bridge building. And he says the response to all of that breaking is not that we're all the same, because that's yet another form of denying us our legitimate differences from which we can exalt our game. But it's a sense of belonging. So we work through our community-based process, to your second question about how impacted communities are involved, help provide that baseline understanding and get everybody's game up here so that when everybody's together in the same room, by virtue of our advocacy, everybody's impressed with each other. They're mutually inquisitive about one another. Everybody brings something to the table to offer. And that helps, through effective programming, to unwind those unconscious biases against poor people and people of color. So we try to work at it from that direction.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. And so for the sake of time, we have about 10 minutes left. And so I'll ask Daryl Moss and then Danielle Purifoy to close us out with questions. If you could ask your question and maybe who it's directed to, and then I'll ask our panelists to maybe give a 1-minute response if possible.
Jamie, I'm actually impressed that you knew my name. We met briefly at the Christmas party. I'm Jamie's colleague at the North Carolina Conservation Network, but I'm also formerly the mayor of my city. Up until December 12th, I was mayor of Creedmoor, which is about 15 miles north of Durham. So what that means is I had the day-to-day responsibility of running my water and sewer system. So those brown bottles of water that you talked about and standing at a sewer spill, I've done that, in the middle of a driving rainstorm. Also, I had the opportunity to serve North Carolina on the Environmental Management Commission for 7 years to develop environmental policy for North Carolina. And my question to you is this, because this is what I have experienced personally. what I call the preemption of local authority. You know, for those communities, those underserved communities that are actually trying to do the right thing, you know, upgrade their infrastructure, pass laws that protect our neighborhoods. Just curious to get your insights on how to overcome that preemption from the state level.
Can you talk about that in the context of Good Old Boys Network? Because that's a fascinating feature.
Yes. Well, in Alabama, the Alabama Department, and basically I deal with families with on-site systems, but in the rural communities, sometimes, you know, the townships have municipal systems. And what has happened there, they've put in place what one grant writer characterized as a cartel. So when the money comes, if you get it, there's an economic development authority that generally writes the grants. And this grant writer said to me, all you have to do is if you look at the plans, and you see that the same people are getting the grants all the time. So it doesn't matter whether or not the quality of the work is good or not. And it doesn't even matter whether the mayor wanted to choose somebody else or the town council. But what happens when the infrastructure is put in place, as in the case in Uniontown, Alabama, which has made national news, they have a failed spray irrigation system that's dumping it into a creek, the sewage. I've seen it firsthand. And downstream is Gee's Bend, if any of you know anything about the quilts of Gee's Bend. That's a historically black community there, where all that raw sewage from Uniontown is going downstream. And basically what has happened is that you can't sue the engineering firm that's connected with the University of Alabama, who's connected with, you know, the people that are part of the powers that be in the state. You can't sue them. They've been paid. And that same, to show how flawed it is that town has gotten more money to expand the same flawed system, and the same engineering firm is getting the money to do it again, despite all of the national attention that Uniontown has gotten, all the people that have gone there, and the local people protesting this. They have just usurped that. And in some cases, what we've also dealt with is not only people not listening to local folk or local officials, some of the local officials are complicit in this. They'll do anything to get a little bit, and even if it's flawed, just to say they've done something. But at the end of the day, their communities are worse off because of the kinds of health disparities that are brought about by the bringing in the dirty industries, and in this case, a flawed wastewater treatment system.
Thank you for that question and that response. And we'll jump into our last question from Danielle. And I know that our panelists will be around today, and there will be other opportunities to possibly ask your questions. So please feel free to do that. Danielle.
Sure. Thank y'all for being here, first off. It's really great to see y'all all polled. Yeah.
It's hard to hear you.
Okay, I'll stand up. Or maybe use one of these things. No, maybe not. Okay. Thank y'all. Thank y'all for being here. Just as a really quick question that we may hear more about later, I'm wondering, so we know that infrastructure is a basic building block for development. And that's, right, I mean, we can't actually have economic development in any of these places without infrastructure. I'm wondering how you grapple with the tension around controlling the kinds of development that comes into communities and what may end up overtaking communities through gentrification and displacement processes once that infrastructure is there. This is something that I've seen in a number of places, and I'm curious to kind of hear any conversations you've had about this. And I know each of these places that you're talking about is in different cities. Yeah.
Well, we have, well, of course, you've seen on the news that there's a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure plan or proposed bill coming through from the Trump administration. But what that bill does not include is it includes direction to primarily redo bridges and highways and expand highways. And as Catherine has repeated, look at replacement of infrastructure in major urban areas, right? What it does not include is getting infrastructure to communities like ours or like Catherine's who's never had it. That bill does not include that. We had a chance, we were contacted by the staff of Senator Cory Booker back in the fall to ask for our input for the National Environmental Justice Bill that's gone through a few revisions that he's gotten some people to sign off on, including congressional official, I think Congressional Representative Reyes, I think I have his name right, from California. And one of the people who's working on it with him is Bernie Sanders, and one of the advisors is Mustafa Ali. Some of you know him and may have met him. He was the National Environmental Justice Director for the federal government for several years at EPA, worked for EPA for 24 years. What we have in our community is what's going on right now, something we started addressing when we first started our organization, was a highway corridor was originally going to eliminate our community. It was going to tear down dozens of houses, churches, dig up a cemetery where African Americans were buried all the way back into slavery, right? And that process is still taking place right now. They're actually building an interstate corridor, an 8-lane corridor, building 4 lanes to start with, all the way from Mebane, North Carolina, I-85 to Danville, Virginia, 27 miles, to go to the western side of Washington, D.C. Now, if you've been on 85 going through Mebane, you'll see a bridge that's being redone. That is 119 that goes right into our community. They have cranes. They put some the cement bridge hangers over a highway just a few weeks ago. So as a part of that, that is a part of building the biggest mega industrial and distribution park in the entire eastern United States, with international concerns coming to that park that were quote-unquote friends of the federal government who will be brought there. The anchors to that park is Ford Motor. The anchors to that park is Walmart. Their distribution facility is there, a $100 million building, and it's the largest Walmart distribution facility in the whole United States. A competition called Lidl, L-I-D-L, from Germany, which is the Walmart of Europe, Germany, built a distribution plant right next to it to compete with Walmart, a $125 million building. Tractor trailer trucks, brand new water lines, brand new sewer lines, brand new streets in and around our community without providing them to the community. That's not going on 50 years ago. We found out about this when we started planning our project 20-some years ago, but nobody believed, they thought we were crazy. We talked to local officials, white and black, because they wanted to know, how in the world did you get access to this information? We talked to the mayor, we talked to the city attorney, and he says, you're a pretty nice guy, Omega, but you don't know what you're talking about. But now there are 9 construction crews working on the highway all over Mebane. The church that I was raised in, one of the churches I was raised in, it was built in 1893 by former slaves, has been torn down as a part of this corridor expansion. So people who thought we were nuts, 20-some years ago, are actually seeing the development of all of these corridors, all these highway expansion, railroad expansion, power line expansions, without the inclusion of the community. Recently, I got a phone call from one of the Duke Power officials who was putting the lines in. He called me out of the blue and said, I found you because of the project at Duke University. He heard about it on public radio. And he called me to apologize that he was one of the supervisors for installing the power lines. And he drove around to realize it was avoiding our community. He said, I cannot do anything about it, but my mom and I, every time I get home, I worry her to death because I know this is not right. But I am doing my what? My job. But I just want to call you and personally apologize for what me and my corporation are doing. He talked to me for 50 minutes.
Thank you, Omega. And thank you, Danielle, for that question. And like I said, please feel free to approach these intelligent, genius folks up here and really dig in and figure out, number one, how you could get involved if you're interested and if you're not already involved. And number two, just stay motivated and be encouraged in the work that you're doing. And I really appreciate you all being here. Please join me again in thanking our panelists for excellent contributions.
Facilitator